This has been a beautiful morning twilight, and we have been singing the tremendously powerful Nama of Bhagwan, Yogi Ramsuratkumar. Even to get this opportunity to be able to sing his name, we could have spent it in sleep. We could have spent this time doing something else. But instead, we have gathered to chant his name. We have been singing his name for 1 hour. Let us be grateful to Bhagwan for this golden opportunity and pray that we should always remember his name. Before we submit our today's prayer, yesterday evening, I was sharing some experiences of devotees which depicted how Bhagwan, the divinity of Bhagwan, expressed itself in the form of Sri Rama, of Ramayana. Today, I would like to share one more incident in the same line which I personally witnessed. Of course, there are other experiences, but we won't go into that. This particular one, it was 94, Bhagwan had shifted from Sannadi Street house to Sudama. At that time, in the adjacent Government Arts College playground, a meeting was arranged for the then Chief Minister to give a talk. There were crowds and crowds and crowds like Deepam festival. People had come from different places in buses, in trains. Such a huge crowd. After the meeting was over, these crowds began to return. And many of them started to come through the lane of Sudama. And what was more, the crowd stopped before Sudama because they had come to know that Visiri Swami was there, shifted from Sannadi Street to this house. So they started to bang on the door and shouted, screamed, "Come out, come out." And more crowds were gathering as time passed. So at one point, Bhagwan got up with a jump and said he sent away some of those devotees, and then he told me to lock the house, stay inside, and he went out. I was so scared for him, but luckily that day, by Bhagwan's grace itself, Sadhu Rangarajan ji had come. So Bhagwan immediately took his hand and began to face the crowd. And the crowd was like a flowing stream, a river in spate. And they began to push Bhagwan, and Bhagwan walked fast in the front, and immediately they were surrounding him, and more crowd. So he was being pushed more and more forward. Immediately I went up. 2 or 3 people were with me, and we were all looking on from the terrace. At the end of the lane, there was a house. There still is a house of a Ramana devotee. The professor who was staying there was well known to us. He used to come to Bhagwan sometimes. So I was hoping that Bhagwan would go into that house, and the devotee there, the professor, would shelter him and lock the gate so that the crowds would not enter. But what happened was just the reverse. As soon as the devotee of the house saw the crowd coming with Bhagwan, he locked his gate and went inside. There was no way Bhagwan could enter the house, with the result that Bhagwan was pinned against the gate, of course with Bhagwan, Sadhu Rangarajan ji also, and the crowds were upon them. Any moment they could be crushed. And they were also shouting. It was mobbish, the excitement of the mob. And we all know what a mob can do in the heat of the moment. I was very, very scared, and we were all chanting Bhagwan's name for Bhagwan's sake, that nothing untoward should happen to Bhagwan or Sadhu Rangarajan. And then, see, the Sannidhi Street house was filled with crowd. Imagine hundreds of people filling up and more joining. And there was no space at all between Bhagwan and the crowd, and they were upon him. Any moment anything could happen. And suddenly Bhagwan took this stick from Sadhu Rangarajan's hand. Bhagwan did not take anything with him. Sadhu Rangarajan had his stick there in his hand, and Bhagwan took that and stood there with a radiant face and hand raised with a danda, that is something like a scepter. He held it high in his hand, just as Sri Rama would stand there with his bow and arrow. He was Sri Raja Ram. He stood there. That's all he did. His face was radiant, and beams of light were pouring out of him. Just for a second, he stood there, and then the next minute, we saw what was happening. The crowds, with their mobbish, the fanatic crowd, with their mobbish excitement, shouting and screaming, suddenly became quiet, and they started to disperse. I'd never seen anything like that before. In my school days, I had read about the war, the huge elephants and the horses let loose in the battlefield, and to control them, how difficult it was for those soldiers. And here was Bhagwan with just raised hand, with the scepter, with the stick in his hand, the ordinary stick. But of course it's a stick blessed by Bhagwan and given to us, given to Sadhu Rangarajan. It served as a scepter in the hand of a king. And the next second, the whole crowd began to disperse quietly. And then Bhagwan returned. After he returned to Sudama, of course we came down, and then we were all happy together that the whole thing went off well. The devotee who locked his gate came running to Sudama, and he fell at the feet of Bhagwan and said, "Swami, I have done a sin. Please forgive me. When you came with the crowd and the crowd was pushing you with its mobbish spirit, I should have opened my gate and let you in. I should have protected you. Instead, I was so scared, I locked the gate and ran inside. It was an act of a coward. He does not become a devotee, and I have committed a sin against you. Only you can forgive me. Please forgive me. Please forgive me." He kept begging Bhagwan, and Bhagwan smiled and blessed him nicely and said, "Devaki, bring a cup of coffee for him." So this is one incident. I'll leave it to you to make what you want of it. And then we shall see how Bhagwan lived in Tiruvannamalai. Sometimes he was one with Arunachaleshwara and acted as Arunachaleshwara, and sometimes he was the divine child of Arunachaleshwara. And sometimes he was a sevak. He served Lord Arunachaleshwara in different capacities at different times. We shall see one or two incidents. At one time, when they were lighting the lamp on the Deepam day, lakhs of people would gather in Tiruvannamalai for the celebration of that, for the darshan of the Deepam. And the Deepam was to burn for 11 days continuously. But it happened that it began to, it was put out by pouring rain or wind, and then there wasn't enough ghee also. So Bhagwan, when he saw that the Deepam was burning only for 3 days and not 11 days, he called all those officials in charge and asked why that was happening. They said the huge vessels of ghee, they were all stolen by people, and they were left with very little ghee for the Deepam. And this was happening repeatedly. And then Bhagwan gave the suggestion that you should take the camphor and mix it freely with the ghee, and nobody will steal this ghee mixed with camphor. Nobody would want it. So they will stay put, and the Deepam will continue burning. And that was adopted, and afterwards there was no such problem. And of course, Arunachaleshwara, the Brahmotsavam, that is the Deepotsavam, the celebration of Deepam for 10 days, every time before they started, Bhagavan would go early morning at 5 o'clock on the very first day, when they would raise the flag of the celebration high with some puja. Swami would go and sit there at 5 o'clock itself. Until the whole function was over, he would be there, blessing people and doing his father's work for the success of the next 10-day celebrations. And every time the chariot would start, they would come and tell him. And initially, Bhagavan would go and he would also pull the chariot for some time. But after that it was stopped because there were too many crowds. And then in any case they would come and inform, but 1 year they did not do so because the officials were all new and they did not know the tradition of the place. And that year the chariot that was moving on the streets had suddenly stopped. And no matter how they tried and tried and tried, it just wouldn't budge. And then after that they came and informed Bhagwan, and within minutes it started to run. It was as though Arunachaleshwara went on strike because his child was not told about it. So whenever this happened, immediately, in the following years, whenever this happened, those people would come to Bhagwan and inform him, and then after that, within a short time, the chariot would start running. There are ever so many incidents. There's one particular incident, with that I have to close this. Once when the chariot was coming, and Swami happened to be in Nadar Lodge with his devotees. He came down to have darshan of Arunachaleshwara, to pay his obeisance to him. It was crowded. He came with a certain speed, and after darshan, he turned somewhat violently, I should say. It was very unusual of him. And there was a blind man nearby, and Bhagavan, with his hand, he kind of pushed him aside, made his way back to Nadar Lodge. People who were witnessing this thought, how could this Swami do this to a blind man? Poor man, he had come all the way from one of the villages nearby. Even though he could not see, he could go with the crowd. He had the happiness of going with the crowd, with Arunachaleshwara. And how could the Swami do this? How could he behave like this? Little knowing what was waiting for them. In a few minutes, they heard the shout of excitement. The blind man was now shouting with such joy. He said, I'm able to see. I'm able to see. Oh, suddenly I got this vision. Who is that one who pushed me aside, who pushed me violently? He has given me my vision. He must be Arunachaleshwara himself. I want to see him. Please take me to him. Please take me to him. All those crowds witnessed this to their wonder and joy. So there are incidents and incidents, leelas and leelas. As you said, it's an ocean of leelas, and we have been seeing day after day after day a few drops of them. In fact, one of those previous leelas I had shared with you, there was one particular leela. I do not know how many of you heard it or how many of you even remember after hearing it. One of the Shivacharya's daughter's son was sick, and no matter how much they tried with the doctors and medicines, there was no cure. And he was suffering, his mother was suffering because of him. And then her father was doing puja to Arunachaleshwara every day, and still nothing was happening. And she was crying to Arunachaleshwara, went to sleep. And in the sleep, Arunachaleshwara appeared in her dream and said, I am that Ramji Swami. In that small house lives Ramji Swami. He is none other than me, myself, in that form. You go there, your son will be cured. And the very next day, the lady was there with her son. And Bhagwan blessed them nicely, and then the son was cured. Proving once again that Bhagwan was none other than Arunachaleshwara himself. Hadn't he said that this beggar, this cottage, this Sanadi Street house is only temporary, but this beggar has been living in huge houses here in Arunachaleshwara temple and in Chidambaram, in Madurai, in Rameshwaram. My permanent abode, he said. Now that Bhagwan is here right in front of us in the form of his Shila Murti, but it is no Shila, it is no statue, it is the living force of Bhagwan filled, infused with his power and grace, and his hand is raised in benediction, and there's a steady flow of grace. We shall offer our prayers to him.